are really going to sleep next to that pile of mud you call an oven, Matthew. A man who beds down with clay bricks is a man who's lost his mind.
You might think differently when the real cold arrives.
The men around the general store laughed, but Matthew just turned and walked toward his cabin. Behind his home, a massive clay oven stood half-finished against the wall, surrounded by piles of brick and mud.
1 hour of fire each morning. The clay will hold the heat for 24 hours.
He picked up a trowel and resumed work, smoothing wet clay over the coursing bricks.
They mock me, but I've seen what a mountain winter can do when the stove goes cold at 3 in the morning.
He worked until sunset, the oven's bulk growing against the cabin wall, a silent promise against the coming cold.
Soon, the snow will come, and then they'll see.
Through the long summer, Matthew hauled clay from the creek and stacked bricks beneath the pines.
The mass is everything. Enough clay, enough brick, and the heat will soak deep.
At the general store, Anthony Cross laughed with the men, gesturing toward Matthew's property.
He's out there playing in the mud while we've got real work to do.
Inside, the clay oven rose, a thick-walled serpent of brick, with a hollow bench along one flank.
When I was a boy, our cabin froze so hard the water bucket shattered by morning.
Rusty never left his side, sleeping in the shade of the half-built oven.
A bench big enough to sleep on, and a second chamber for bread. They'll mock until they feel it.
When the aspen leaves turned gold, the oven stood complete, a monument of earth and fire.
Let them laugh. This oven will be the difference between life and death when winter comes.
Matthew lit the first fire in the completed oven. The dry clay hissed as the heat began to spread.
The bench draws the warmth. Already I can feel it rising through the stone.
He placed his palm against the curved wall and held it there, counting the hours.
But the cold hasn't come yet. This is nothing. The real trial waits.
Outside the general store, an old-timer squinted at the sky and pulled his worn coat tighter. He warned that a hard winter was on its way, the kind that cracked iron stoves and froze men in their beds before dawn. A week later, the first snow dusted the aspen grove. Matthew stood beside his oven, watching.
Here it begins. I'll need more wood, more kindling, but the oven is ready.
He spent the next days splitting logs and stacking them high against the cabin wall.
Let the winter come. I've done all I can.
By mid-December, the temperature plunged to 10 below zero. The mountain air bit through walls and bones alike. Matthew rose before dawn and fed the firebox, a single hour of blazing pine. Then he sealed the draft.
The clay is drinking the fire. By noon, this bench will still be warm.
From the village, the townspeople saw only a single plume of smoke rising from his chimney each morning.
1 fire a day. He'll be freezing in there. Sheer luck. The cold hasn't killed him yet.
Unseen, Matthew opened the bread chamber and slid in a pan of risen dough. The oven's retained heat would bake it slowly.
While they huddle over dying stoves, I'll eat fresh bread, but they need to believe it's impossible.
The frost on the window grew thick as milk glass, but the cabin stayed warm from floor to rafters.
That mud heap will crack when the real cold hits. Mark my words.
But not yet. Not at 10 below. The real test hasn't even begun.
Then the mercury fell to 20 below zero. The cold pressed down like a stone slab against the mountains. In the village, iron stoves glowed red. But the moment a fire died, frost crept into the rooms and froze the water buckets.
My cabin holds steady. The clay radiates warmth hour after hour, just as I planned.
Every morning, the scent of baking bread drifted from his chimney and curled through the frozen streets, like a promise nobody could keep.
That smell. He's baking bread while we can't keep our houses warm. Something's not right.
They're beginning to notice. Good. Let them wonder what fuels that oven.
Neighbors woke shivering at 3 in the morning to restoke their stoves, their sleep broken and their tempers frayed.
He's hoarding heat, I say. That oven's a trick, or he's got a secret fuel supply hidden somewhere.
But no one knocked on Matthew's door. Pride and the old mockery held them back.
The real cold hasn't even begun. When it drops to 40 below, they'll come to me.
At the general store, the scent of bread had become a bitter point of contention.
How are you baking, Matthew? You've got no proper stove.
The oven has a bread chamber. The retained heat does the work.
Lies. You are hoarding fuel, or you've got a secret stove hidden under that clay.
Before the argument could escalate, a man burst through the door with a telegram from the Valley Weather Station. The telegram warned of an unprecedented cold front, 40 below zero, with 70-mile winds, arriving within 2 days. Inside the store, silence fell, then broke into frantic movement as people grabbed whatever supplies remained in desperation.
They're panicked, but I've already prepared. Extra flour, salt, yeast, everything I need.
He walked home through the darkening afternoon, the sky already swelling with the coming storm.
2 days, then the real test begins.
The blizzard struck at dusk, a white wall of wind and ice that swallowed the valley whole. Inside the cabin, Matthew fed the firebox a concentrated hour of birch and pine until the clay glowed with stored energy.
The mass is soaking it in. Now I seal the drafts and let it radiate until morning.
He settled onto the bench with Rusty curled at his feet, the storm howling harmlessly beyond the thick walls. Across the settlement, families huddled around iron stoves, feeding them constantly, as the cold leaked through every crack. But sleep was the enemy. When exhaustion won, the fires died, and the temperature inside plunged to match the killing cold outside. By 2 in the morning, the thermometer outside read 40 below, and the wind screamed with a voice that sounded alive.
The bench is still warm to the touch. The clay holds.
In the village, water buckets froze solid in the kitchens, and frostbite began to claim fingers and toes.
They'll have to swallow pride now. By morning, they'll be at my door.
The first gray light of morning revealed a world locked in ice. Inside Matthew's cabin, the bench radiated steady, gentle warmth. He rose and opened the firebox, feeding it a measured armful of split wood. The clay would drink the heat and store it. Then he slid a pan of risen dough into the bread chamber. By noon, there would be fresh loaves, steam rising, in a cabin nearby. A father discovered his drinking water had frozen solid overnight. His children coughed in the bitter air. 3 doors down, an old woman wept as she wrapped her husband's frostbitten fingers, white and hard as stone.
They mocked the pile of mud. Now it's the only thing that stayed warm.
From his window, the village appeared lifeless. No smoke rose from any chimney along the frozen street. Then the first knock came, tentative, desperate. Another followed, and soon a crowd gathered outside his door. Their faces were drawn, frost clinging to beards and brows, eyes begging through the frozen air.
They called me a fool. Now they're freezing. But do I let them in?
Matthew unlatched the door and swung it wide, warm air spilling into the frozen morning.
Come inside, the old and the young first. The bench will hold.
An elderly couple shuffled in, their shivering easing as the radiant heat met their skin. A mother with a small child followed, the boy pressing his hands against the warm clay as if it were alive.
1 hour of fire each morning. The clay mass holds it for 24 hours. That's all.
He tore a warm loaf into pieces and passed them around. the steam rising like a blessing. By midday, the bench was lined with neighbors, blankets draped over their shoulders, faces slowly softening.
I don't see Anthony among them. Too much pride, or he's too far gone.
He gazed out the frost-laced window toward the dark cabin at the edge of the settlement where no smoke rose.
He'll freeze before he asks. I may have to go to him.
By evening, Matthew had organized a rotation. Families came in shifts, warming themselves on the broad bench while fresh bread baked.
Keep the firebox closed. The stored heat will last until dawn.
At the edge of the settlement, Anthony's cabin sat in frozen silence, its windows opaque with ice. Inside, Anthony sat slumped against the cold iron stove, his breath shallow, hands buried in his armpits.
Can't feel my fingers. Should have swallowed pride and gone like the others.
He remembered a summer years before, a half-built wall crumbling under his hands, while a master mason shook his head.
Couldn't build a wall that stood. Couldn't build a stove that burned. Useless.
Through the frozen window, he could see the faint orange glow from Matthew's cabin and the thin thread of smoke rising.
That mud pile I mocked is warmer than my whole life has ever been. If I freeze tonight, they'll say it was pride. They'll be right.
As the last neighbor shuffled into the night, Matthew stood at the window, watching the dark cabin at the settlement's edge.
No smoke, no light. He's still in there. He won't survive another night.
He pulled on his heaviest coat and stepped into the wind, snow stinging his face as he pushed toward the frozen cabin. The door was stuck with ice. He shouldered it open to find Anthony slumped against the dead stove, barely conscious.
Get up. I am not leaving you here.
Don't need charity.
This isn't charity. It's common sense. Now hold on.
He wrapped Anthony's arm over his shoulder and half-carried him through the drifts, the wind cutting like a blade. Inside the warm cabin, he laid Anthony on the bench near the glowing clay, covering him with blankets.
He's breathing. The oven will do its work now.
When Anthony stirred, his eyes were hard, his jaw set against the warmth that had saved him.
Why did you drag me here? To gloat? To prove you were right?
I brought you because no one deserves to freeze alone. Not even a man who called me a fool.
I don't believe you.
Matthew placed a thick slice of bread beside him and said nothing, letting the warmth do its own convincing.
You baked this in that thing? How?
The oven has 2 chambers. The main firebox heats the mass, and the baking chamber uses stored heat.
Anthony's gaze traced the brick layout, the smooth clay, the careful slope of the bench, his eyes lingering on the precise joints.
This isn't a mud pile. This is real craftsmanship, better than anything I ever built.
He's seeing it now. Maybe there's more to him than bitterness.
The cold held for days. Families brought what little flour and salt they had spared, adding to Matthew's dwindling stores.
He's been running himself ragged. When does he rest?
Anthony sat up, his voice low, the question pulling itself out before he could stop it.
Where did you learn to build something like this?
From an old Russian mason who wintered here years ago. He said the secret was in the mass.
As Matthew spoke, Anthony leaned forward, his eyes fixed on him, not the oven.
The mass. So you don't fight the cold, you just store the heat.
Exactly. 1 hour of fire, and the clay does the rest.
For a moment, there was no bitterness between them, only the crackle of the fire and the quiet understanding of 2 men who knew stone.
Maybe I could learn from him if he'd let me.
The temperature crept up to 10 below, but flour sacks were nearly empty, and the settlement was running on fading hope.
We need another oven. A big one at the community hall. 1 fire for everyone who can't fit here.
I was a mason once, before I failed. The wall collapsed. The foreman told me I'd never amount to anything.
The confession hung in the warm air. Matthew didn't look away.
I can help you build it, if you'll let me try.
Then let's get to work.
They walked to the community hall through the trampled snow, carrying tools and the first load of bricks. Anthony's hands, still raw from frostbite, moved with slow purpose, laying bricks under Matthew's quiet guidance.
He's not the man they mocked. He's a mason who lost his way. Maybe we can both build something here.
Word spread through the settlement, and by midday others arrived at the community hall with shovels, bricks, and frozen lumps of clay.
My hands remember the work, even after all these years. The clay feels right.
You've still got the touch. Keep the walls thick. Let the mass do the work.
Neighbors took turns mixing clay and stacking bricks, their breath misting in the cold air of the unheated hall.
We'll build the bread chamber here. Same design as yours, just larger.
By evening, the oven's form loomed in the hall, a hulking, earthy shape that promised shared warmth.
This one won't collapse, not while I am working it.
He's building more than an oven. He's rebuilding himself.
As the final bricks were laid on the third day, the community hall oven stood ready, its massive bench curving along one side.
Tomorrow, we light her. One fire, and she'll keep this hall warm for a day.
At dawn, a crowd gathered as Matthew lit the first fire in the community hall oven. The dry clay warmed with a soft hiss, and hope flickered in the flames.
Let it burn hot for an hour, then seal the draft. The mass will do the rest.
By noon, the great bench radiated heat, and the hall filled with townspeople shedding their frozen coats, laughter returning.
It's working. The design is sound. For the first time in years, I am proud to have built something.
Before the fire had cooled, a farmer stepped forward, asking if they could build an oven for his family.
We'll build them for everyone. Anthony and I will teach you how.
Matthew and Anthony hauled clay from the frozen creek, stacking bricks beside a dozen cabins. Anthony's voice grew steady as he guided neighbors through the brickwork, his hands sure and certain. By the end of the week, new ovens stood beside a dozen cabins, their chimneys waiting for the first whisper of smoke.
I never thought I'd be part of something that could save lives.
That evening, by the glow of the original oven, Anthony's guard finally fell, and the full story spilled out.
It wasn't just a wall. It was a schoolhouse. The clay wouldn't set because the soil was rubble. The master blamed me. He said I was worthless, and I believed him for 20 years.
You were never worthless. You were a good mason given a bad foundation.
I mocked you because I was jealous. You built what I couldn't.
That's behind us. From now on, you are my partner.
Matthew offered his hand. Anthony stared at it for a long moment, then clasped it tightly.
For the first time in 20 years, I feel like a man who can build something that lasts.
The original oven pulsed with soft heat, witnessing a bond forged in failure and remade in fire.
Sometimes redemption is just a matter of getting your hands back in the clay.
A week later, the settlement looked reborn. A dozen chimneys sent thin threads of smoke into the cold air, once a day, as if the whole valley breathed.
All those cabins, all those families. And it started with a pile of mud they laughed at.
They mocked us both once. Now their children will grow up warm.
They walked the frozen path back to Matthew's cabin, the dog Rusty trotting ahead, his tail brushing the snow. Inside, the original oven still glowed with the morning's fire, the bench warm and inviting under the frost-laced window.
This bench has held the cold at bay for 40 nights, and it will hold for 40 more.
You built more than an oven, Matthew. You built a second chance.
Matthew said nothing, just rested a hand on the oven's warm clay and watched the dog curl tighter on the bench. Outside, the row of cabins stood silent in the snow, every chimney bearing a thin wisp of smoke, a quiet testimony.
And from that winter on, no one in this valley ever called a clay oven a pile of mud again.
The morning sun broke over the ridge, lighting the valley where a dozen thin columns of smoke rose from the cabins.
This winter will pass, but other valleys will face the same cold without this knowledge.
We'll travel to them. Teach them how to build mass ovens before the next freeze.
They spent the afternoon at the community hall, where neighbors who had learned the craft now demonstrated it to others. A boy pressed his hands against the warm clay, and his mother smiled, breaking a piece of fresh bread.
This is what it means to leave something behind. Not just warmth, but the knowledge to create it.
When I think of all those years wasted on bitterness, this is a better way to spend a life.
They stood in the gathering twilight, watching the last thread of smoke curl into the starry sky above the row of cabins.
Not a bad legacy for a pile of mud.
And the valley, once frozen in mockery, now breathed warmth from within. That night, a deep stillness settled over the valley. The only movement was the pale smoke rising from the row of cabins. Inside his cabin, Matthew sat on the clay bench, Rusty stretched beside him, the dogs breathing slow and deep.
40 nights it held. 40 dawns I woke to warmth. The clay did all the work.
He placed his hand on the curved surface, feeling the last embers' gentle heat radiate through the clay.
They called it a pile of mud, but it saved us all.
Outside, the frost painted the window white, but inside, the oven's amber glow filled the room like a heartbeat.
Tomorrow, I'll fire it again. 1 hour, and it will care for me another day.
He leaned back against the curved warmth, and for a long moment, he simply watched the dogs sleep. The original oven stood silent and strong, a monument of clay and brick that had turned mockery into survival. And in the quiet of that frozen night, the cabin held its warmth as it would for all the winters to come. As the days lengthened and the snow began to soften, the clay ovens remained, blackened by smoke but solid as the mountains themselves. On a clear morning, Matthew and Anthony stood where the path overlooked the settlement, Rusty sitting patiently between them.
I was wrong, Matthew. I should have said it long ago.
That's in the past. We're building for the future now.
They clasped hands again, not as two men bound by a crisis, but as partners standing on solid ground.
The oven taught us both how to hold warmth and how to share it.
They stood in silence, watching the row of cabins exhale their daily plume, a rhythm of survival that had become a promise. The original chimney, the first one they'd mocked, traced a ribbon of white against the paling sky.
I spent 20 years thinking I was worthless. Now I know I was just waiting for the right foundation.
And in the heart of that valley, a giant clay oven glowed on, warm enough for a man to sleep beside. On the last cold evening before the thaw, Matthew and Anthony stood in the cabin. The dog curled on the bench as embers pulsed softly.
I once called this a pile of mud. Now it feels like the heart of the valley.
The clay doesn't judge. It only holds whatever fire you give it.
They said nothing more, listening to the quiet crackle and the slow breaths of the sleeping dog. Outside, the sun sank behind the peaks, painting the snow in amber and rose. Along the row of cabins, thin columns of smoke rose one by one, as they had every day since the Great Freeze. The first chimney, the one they had mocked, still breathed its steady plume against the cooling sky. And from that winter on, no cabin in the valley ever went without a warm bench. The giant clay oven glowed on in the quiet, its builder asleep beside it, a man who had turned mud into mercy. And the valley slept, wrapped in the warmth of clay and fire.